In this Hobbit Draft Meta update, I'll be providing you with the most current information on the format so you can crush your next draft. First up, the format news, and our first headline, it's a small world set, because this is maybe the last of the small sets ever, maybe just the last one for a while, but it is a smaller card file, which means there are less instants and sorceries and flash speed things that you have to worry about, that you have to play around, and so you can make your plays with a little bit more insight into what your opponent might be having, especially if it's something a little bit more expensive, like a Confusticate and Bother as a 3-mana counterspell, or a Reverent Howl as a 3-mana combat trick. To help you with this, I have this sheet of all instants plus considerations. So these are cards that are the instant speed, flash speed. It includes cards of all rarities, and it's the exact sheet that I was using when I was playing in my Hobbit Arena Directs, which is a high stakes Hobbit tournament. And so it was battle tested in the crucible, you could say, where I really wanted to win. And so I had this sheet where I wasn't referencing it constantly, but if there was ever a situation where there was potentially a weird play from my opponent, or I just knew that, okay, I'm in a really good spot, I just need to lock up this game, they're holding up 4 mana, these are their 2 colors, what could they have? I would just reference this real quick just to be safe a lot of the time, and just to be like, okay, what could they have? Okay, there's a rare that they might have that maybe in a normal set I wouldn't play around the rare because there's so many more instants and sorceries at common and uncommon to play. Oh, not instants and sorceries, instants and flash spells and stuff like that at common and uncommon to play around. But in this case, I can be like, okay, I'll play around the rare as well because I might as well. They only have a few options, and this one actually makes sense for them to have. There's also a couple of cards on this list that are not specifically instants and flash spells, because sometimes it's good to know about something like a Gandalf Sparkstar to being able to deal 3 damage divided as they choose, where it's like, okay, my opponent's making this attack that'll put 3 of my creatures to 1 toughness, or with 2 damage on them, and they have 1 like they only need 1 more damage to be finished off. If I make this block, then their Gandalf just wipes my board if they have it, and they have 6 mana and they're playing red. This could be a consideration, or something like a Glow in the Mighty, which will deal 1 as well. Those sorts of things. Or like, okay, well, if I make this attack, I die to them having a large bear with haste, and they've been playing aggressively all game, so maybe they have that. Those sorts of things where they're not specifically instants or flash spells, but they are still things that are worth considering. So I had those on this list as well. But overall, it's just a list of all the things that I was considering personally when playing in a high stakes tournament. Especially the instants can be very, very helpful to know, because in a small set, they can all kind of fit onto 1 page. And so that's something that you should be keeping in mind, and you can use these sorts of insights to play better and play around more things. Next highlight, Live by the Blade. The Crude Bent Blade is a very strong card in this format. Playing around it can definitely get you an advantage, because the equipment itself is just pretty powerful. 2 mana to equip to give +2/+1 gives some serious inevitability, turning pretty much any 2-powered creature into like a must-answer threat. But if you can play around the sacrifice part of the card, you can mitigate some of the serious damage it can deal. Some of this is just by having a good curve. If you have to sacrifice a 2-drop, that's a lot less of an impact than if you have to sacrifice your 3-drop because you stumbled and missed your 2-mana play. But sometimes you can also be like, okay, my opponent's trying to trade off small creatures. Maybe that's because they have a Crude Bent Blade post-combat. They're trying to use that sort of thing. It's a great card. You should be taking it highly, and you should be trying to put it yourself into situations to wreck your opponent with it, and trying to make sure that you mitigate its impact if you think your opponent might have it. And then our final headline is a massive advantage, because a mass kind of aggro, kind of just red-black in general, has been a really, really good color combination, which you will kind of see demonstrated as we get into the meta market part of this video, where I talk about the best archetypes and the rankings and stuff like that. But it's just a really strong color combination because the individual cards are good, the aggressive game plan is good, and the just cards work well together, which is really nice as well. So moving on to that meta market, first things first, the archetype rankings. No surprise, as I just mentioned, a mass aggro coming in first. It's really just black-red aggro, and then a lot of the good cards happen to have a mass tacked onto them as well. So you'll have a card like Goblin Plate Mail, which is maybe like the poster child at common for this kind of deck. It's like technically a hybrid card, so you can play it in all sorts of homes, and you definitely will play it in all sorts of homes, but it kind of is emblematic of what this deck is doing, where it just gets like a 2-mana 2/1 menace creature essentially, and then when you are like in the late game, you can just start giving your other things menace, and so you kind of grind into the late game more effectively than you might in other aggressive strategies, because you just have some lasting advantages from your cards, or your cards have some value associated with them. Bothersome Noisemaker is kind of the most scary 2-drop that you can face a lot of the time from this deck, because if you don't kill it, then any non-creature spell is just going to give them extra board impact, which is really scary, especially because some of the non-creature spells they would be casting give them board impact already because they're cards that like amass or things of that nature. And then down to Goblin Town can actually be a really annoying card from this deck as well. It might not look like it adds the most onboard stats because its second chapter is only amassing Goblins 1, but making you being able to make your opponent discard a card is really, really good. If your opponent casts this against you, you kind of lose your answer, and they kind of know what's coming, so they can kind of mess up your curve to help their aggressive plan. And the drain for 2 with chapters 3 and 4 by draining for 1 can be really, really scary in closing out games. Also, if you're playing like a mirror kind of match, being able to play this sort of card that eventually gains you some life can be really nice as well to help you swing the race around, where you might start off on the back foot and then eventually you have your down to Goblin Town take one of their best cards, and then eventually the drain is going to help you kind of turn the corner and start flipping and being the aggressive element yourself if you were maybe a little bit on the back foot, which down to Goblin Town doesn't add the most stats, so it can put you a little bit behind, but the drain for 2 really does make a big difference on the card. Next up in the archetype rankings, 4 Powered Matters. It's kind of a green-black deck. This is just kind of like emblematic of the fact that black is very strong, and you can combine that with a little bit of green to help your strategy. So a card like Night Howl Pursuer, you play this on turn 1, you're hoping to put creatures with 4 power into your deck to turn this into a 3/3 menace attacker as quickly as possible. A nasty little rabbit, really, really scary on turn 1. Once it starts growing, especially once it gets to 4 power itself and is just like a self-contained little engine that grows over and over and over, that can be a really, really scary card. It only costs 1 mana, and so these sorts of 1-drops can really kick the game off nicely. And then Desolation Prowler, fantastic in any black deck. Your red-black deck loves Desolation Prowler, but especially in this sort of deck where you have Night Howl Pursuer and nasty little rabbits, hopefully, the Desolation Prowler is a 2-mana creature that can get to 4 power. Really, really scary card. And if you are playing Desolation Prowler, there are some shenanigans that you can get up to with the card, where like if you attack with this card and your opponent's holding up 2 mana, including a red mana, there's a 2-mana deal 3 at instant speed. So sometimes you won't want to activate the Desolation Prowler, because if you activate it in response, your opponent could kill it with a deal 3 effect, whereas if you just hold up the activation, your opponent can never really kill it with that effect. And sometimes you don't necessarily want to pay 2 life to deal 2 extra damage to your opponent. Sometimes it's really good. You just want to make sure you're playing the card correctly, knowing how to use it to its full potential, dodge removal when you can, things of that nature. But it's really, really strong. And if you just hit them for like 4, if you're the aggressor and you're hitting them for 4 a turn with your 2-drop, the game just ends in a hurry. Next up is Blue-White Draw 2. So this has some of the recruit mechanic involved, but also just like a lot of cards that reward you for drawing your second card. In the uncommon, there's Bard the Bowman, which is really nice for turning your kind of draw spells into a little bit of extra life gain to help you kind of stabilize if you are playing against a more aggressive red-black deck. There's Lakeshore Apothecary as a growing 2-drop. This card really, really gets out of hand in a hurry when you're playing this deck, because there are just lots of ways to draw cards. And eventually you have like a 2-mana 4/5 or something like that, and Lakeshore Apothecary coming down on turn 2, being a growing threat, really, really strong. And then Patient Instructor has been quite nice, because there's a lot of the time you don't mind having certain cards to discard to your recruit, so you get that extra 1/1. Drawing 2 cards helps you if you curve Lakeshore Apothecary into Patient Instructor. And in the late game, if you have extra lands, Patient Instructor's almost like just drawing a card when you're able to get rid of lands you don't need. And so it's a really nice, effective tool for this deck. Again, the hybrid mana with Blue-White Hybrid means that you can just play this in any white deck or any blue deck, and you often will, but it's especially good in this home, which is pretty nice to see. Next up is the red-white storied aggro deck. Red-white and blue-white are pretty close depending on the exact distribution of cards that you see, but red-white is a pretty strong, those two decks are kind of like pretty close to each other. Storied aggro, however, is trying to leverage aggressive curve outs using cards like Thorin Oakenshield, which is just a good statted card. 2 mana 3/2. If you have an Enduring Story, which means you have 3 artifacts, legendaries, and or sagas, you have an Enduring Story, your things get slightly buffed. So Thorin Oakenshield will give your artifacts and creatures Ward 1, which makes them a little bit harder to interact with. There's a lot of minor benefits you get for Enduring Story. None of them are crazy powerful, but it's nice to have, and it's not the hardest to get. Iron Hills Blacksmith is a really good 2-drop for this deck, because it's not legendary itself, but it makes an equipment, and that's an artifact which will help with your Enduring Story. And these equipments really go a long way in your red-white decks, because when you have these couple of extra equipments, it means that in the late game situations, you'll have the ability to buff up your team a little bit and maybe stack all of your equipments onto one creature so it can get in an attack, that sort of thing, forcing your opponent to deal with your small creatures, even once they've maybe assembled a bit of a wall against them. Like maybe they've stabilized the board state, then you have a couple equipment, you can just start moving those around. And don't sleep on a 2-mana 1/1 double strike either. That's pretty good, especially with its equipment. And then Dory, Bearer of Friends, really nice for just enabling your Enduring Story. If you go turn 2 Thorin, turn 3 Dory, you immediately have the Enduring Story because of that treasure token. The treasure can then help you double spell on a future turn, enable a splash, do all sorts of good things. You do need to be a little bit careful if you are taking cards like Dory, because if you get too many of them, you can't really always play all of them because it's legendary. So be a little bit careful with that when you are playing your red-white decks. If you have like a couple of Thorin Oaken Shields already, maybe don't take the third one, because you don't want to end up in a spot where you have 2 or 3 of them in your opening hand and you just kind of feel like you can't actually deploy your cards. Next up, and finally, we have blue-green landfall. There's also a minor little bit of elf stuff going on here, but it's mostly just a landfall deck, and it's a little bit weaker. This one's actually kind of behind. So like the first couple are kind of set apart because the black cards are really strong. Then blue, white, and white, red are kind of close to each other. They're kind of like neck and neck. And then blue, green is a little bit of a ways behind. What you have here is what you want to be playing is just like really strong on-rate cards like Mirkwood Pathmaker. You notice it has no synergy whatsoever with landfall. It's just kind of a generically good card. And that's kind of what you're doing in this deck. There's not really a ton of support for just like, there's not tons of cards that care about landfall. There's not tons of cards that care about elves. You just want to be playing good cards. And so if you are getting good cards, you can certainly play this strategy. Thranduil is one of the only like real synergy payoff / enablers for this deck. It's a 4-mana play. It gives you extra 1/1s when you play lands. And then if you are playing that adventure mode, it can help you hit land drops in the late game when maybe you like top deck Thranduil, you don't have any lands left, or maybe only 1 left. You can play the adventure first, help yourself find some lands so that you can consistently trigger your cards. And then Bjorn's Hospitality can actually be a really effective tool in this sort of strategy if you are able to consistently hit land drops, which blue can do by having card draw, and that can just be like a nice way to just be like, okay, I'm drawing extra cards, so I'm not going to be missing land drops, and so Bjorn's Hospitality is going to help me turn my extra land drops into stats and eventually just be a ginormous creature that kind of has haste, because if Bjorn's Hospitality has been sitting in play, you activate this, you can immediately attack with it because it's just been sitting around, and so that's worth knowing as well. And then there's one little piece of added synergy. There is a common land that can go search your deck for another land. So it's called Hobbit Hole. You play it, you can activate it to sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land, and put it into play tapped. And that's really good with some of these landfall cards, because with Bjorn's Hospitality, for example, you'll get 2 +1/+1 counters. With Thranduil, you'll get 2 1/1s. And so if you have that card in your deck, being able to use that to effectively leverage your synergy pieces with landfall can be a pretty nice little edge, but there's not tons of landfall stuff, and so you just need to be playing good blue and green cards first and primarily, and then sometimes you'll have a little bit of landfall synergy. So moving on to the color rankings, you can probably guess black at number 1. It just has fantastic cards at common, has fantastic cards at uncommon, it's got some good rares. It's pretty much just like a great color to be in this format. Black, red, and black, green are really, really good decks as a result, mostly just because black is so good. Black, red just also has good complementary synergy as well. Red coming in number 2. Red is just got good removal spells. It's got good cards that you like at common specifically. A couple of the colors that we will get to have like very few cards that you are interested in playing, but red has some good removal. It has some good cards. It has like decent synergies with both of its color combinations, with both white and with black. It's really especially good, and so it's a really good place to be. Next up, we have white and blue kind of tied. The reason I put them tied is because white has like really good rares and some really good uncommons, but its commons are like horrifically bad and like almost like to the point where a lot of them you're like not even interested in playing. And so that can kind of like skew the color, where if you open a really good white like rare or something, then you can like support it with a couple of uncommons and then like pair it with another color and hopefully get some depth there. Whereas blue has some really good commons and uncommons, especially compared to white, but it doesn't really have great rares. There's like maybe 1 or 2 rares that are like good in blue, maybe only 1 rare that's good in blue, depending on how you evaluate the cards. And it's a couple of rares that are good in blue. But yeah, I don't try to spend too much time talking about the rares, but in this case, it's like normally the rares are all pretty good, but blue's rares are pretty bad, but blue's commons, and then even so, like blue's commons are pretty good, and then its uncommons are okay. But like generally speaking, white is so much worse in the commons department than blue is that it's like kind of hard to be like, okay, I'm going to build a deck around white unless you see like one of the really good uncommons or rares for the deck. And then green coming in last. There's a couple of okay commons that you'll play for the deck. There's a couple of okay uncommons, but like generally speaking, it's just like not the greatest color. It doesn't really necessarily pair well with things. One of the reasons I put blue a little bit like in the line, I put blue below white, is because like blue green is like one of the supported color combinations. So when you're playing blue, sometimes you're playing it with green, which definitely drags it down a little bit. But yeah, it's not necessarily that like green is unplayable or anything. It just has like kind of weak cards in general, and a lot of the cards you aren't particularly interested in playing. But it still can be the right deck to play if it's open, because there are still some strong things going on if you get like enough of the uncommons and things like that. Next up is the format speed. This format is definitely fast. Because the best deck is like a red-black kind of aggro deck, and because the black-green deck can also be pretty quick, and the like red-white deck can also be pretty quick, like a lot of the archetypes in this set are just leaning aggressively, and that means that this format would be, I think, classified as a fast format, especially because there are some of those just stat monsters. When we were talking about the black-green deck, there's like 1 mana 3/3 menaces. There's like a 1/2 that just grows every turn. There's Desolation Prowler, the 2-drop that can become a 4/4 when it's attacking. Those sorts of things really can accelerate the speed of a format, which means you really need to be focused on your curve, making sure you're impacting the game on the early turns of the game, so that even if you are trying to go a little bit later into the game, you don't get run over and actually have time to enact your late game strategy. And then moving on to the final section, Nicolai's sleeper cards. The first one is Master's Counselors. This card is really, really effective, but it's often kind of the sort of card that's tricky to use because players hate milling themselves. So it's 1 and a blue, it's a 1/3 with Vigilance. It gets +2/+0 for each graveyard with 7 or more cards in it. When you draw your second card each turn, target player mills 3 cards, which means you can mill yourself or you can mill your opponent. Milling yourself is generally going to be better. It's best friends with a card like Plunder the Trollshaws, because casting Plunder the Trollshaws will let you enable to draw a second card, and then you can mill yourself. And if you mill over other copies of Plunder the Trollshaws or anything else that cares about your graveyard, it's really, really effective. And so Master's Counselors, anytime you mill a card that's relevant, that's like almost like drawing an extra resource or getting some little bit of an advantage, and eventually it becomes like a 5/3 with Vigilance. One of the downsides of milling your opponent in this format is if they are playing a lot of decks, like say they're playing a black-red deck, if you mill your opponent and they hit something like a Golem the Abandoned into their graveyard, which can sacrifice something to return itself from the graveyard to the hand, you've given your opponent an advantage, which means even if you don't have any graveyard synergies at all, you should generally be trying to mill yourself first, because what if your opponent has Plunder the Trollshaws? What if your opponent has a Golem? What if your opponent has some sort of recursion that returns a creature from their graveyard to their hand, or a flashback spell? Anything like that, milling your opponent is a downside. Milling yourself doesn't really affect your game plan. As long as you're not going to mill yourself out, you're generally just going to be fine milling yourself. If you are trying to get the stats boost, you want to like mill yourself till you get the 7, then mill them till they get the 7. That's generally going to be how that often goes. But you're not generally going to have enough mill in your deck. This is the only mill card supported in the format in terms of milling your opponent. And so you're not going to be able to mill your opponent out, generally speaking. There's pretty decent removal. They can eventually kill this thing before it can mill them out. But if you are like using Master's Counselors and you are just milling your opponent, you can give them advantages. And so you want to make sure it's a really strong card, because it can be like a 2 mana 5/3 Vigilance. That's pretty good. And it can even draw you extra resources, as we discussed. But you need to be careful not to just mill your opponent for the sake of milling your opponent. Make sure you're doing things strategically, trying to do it only when it's going to grow the Master's Counselors and not giving your opponent an extra advantage. Next up in the sleeper cards is Mirkwood Nurturer. It's 2 blue-green hybrid for a 3/2. When it enters, return up to one other target permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, you get a counter on this creature. You're almost always going to want to do that. You don't just want to be playing 3 mana 3/2s. One thing you can do is you can bounce your own lands in the late game so you can replay them to get a little bit of landfall synergy. That's kind of like often going to be the way things go in your blue-green decks, because blue-green, ironically, is the color combo that has kind of the least like crazy good things to bounce. Whereas in black, you get Crude Bent Blade. We already discussed it. But if you played Mirkwood Nurturer, bounce your Crude Bent Blade, play it again, that can be a pretty effective way to use the card, especially because sometimes your opponent will have like one small creature to sacrifice to the Bent Blade, and then they have to start sacrificing bigger and bigger ones. So if you can use that synergy, that's pretty effective. And then it's kind of a wombo combo with Mountain King's Return. It's 2 and a white. Chapter 1 is Recruit, but Chapter 2 is return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you use that to return Mirkwood Nurturer, it can then return the Mountain King's Return back to your hand, and then you can play the Mountain King's Return again, get another Recruit, and then if Mirkwood Nurturer dies, you can keep getting it back. It's just kind of like a little bit of a value loop engine. You can play Mirkwood Nurturer, bring back Mountain Kings, and you get a bunch of like Recruit synergies, and you can return the Mirkwood Nurturer if it dies again. That sort of thing can be pretty effective, and is just a nice little combo to be aware of. Mirkwood Nurturer works very well with sagas, as you might imagine. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag Hobbit Skills in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck in your next drafts, and I'll talk to you next time.